Welcome back, adventurer. Tonight the dust has opinions, not ordinary dust, not the harmless powder that gathers on an unloved shelf and waits to accuse a lazy servant in the morning. I mean the older kind, the dust that used to be walls, the dust that remembers bronze, the dust that settles on ledgers written by hands convinced they had solved history. It lies in the folds of old maps and on the lips of buried kings. It drifts where towers once told the horizon what shape obedience should take. Stone keeps intention, dust keeps the invoice. And there is a great deal of invoice in the East. Here in the hidden stacks beneath Waterdeep, where the candles burn with the patient discourtesy of things that know they will outlast municipal fashions, the shelves have taken on a faint desert scent. Old vellum, dry mortar, a whisper of copper. Somewhere above us, a fishmonger is announcing freshness with all the conviction of a man standing atop 10,000 years of rot and repair. Somewhere farther west, a mason is congratulating himself on a respectable foundation while dwarven dead, several layers down the chain of causation, remain too polite to laugh aloud. And somewhere far beyond this city, under purple dust and dead suns of memory, the ruins of Imaskar continue to demonstrate that arrogance is one of the few substances that can survive empire. You have returned to the Lich's tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. I am Irillian Cantonine, Baelnorn, Lore Warden, keeper of difficult continuities, and one of the increasingly few custodians still willing to distinguish between civilization and its self-description. The distinction matters. Every empire writes speeches about itself. Far fewer leave behind structures honest enough to describe what they really believed. If you wish to know a people, do not first ask whom they praised. Ask what they built large enough to survive apology. Last time we went under mountain. We traced the dwarven ages through halls, roads, cisterns, tombs, compacts, and griefs durable enough to become architecture. We asked what a dwarven kingdom actually rules, and the answer, if you recall, was not merely land, it was obligation. The dwarves ruled the span between the dead and the unborn. They built continuity with enough stubborn competence that whole later nations walked along dwarven intention without knowing it. At the end of that descent, I warned you that the balance was shifting. Because while dwarves hammered duty into stone, humans were learning something more volatile. They were learning how quickly a realm could scale if it treated magic not as wonder, not as priestly mystery, not even as personal mastery, but as infrastructure. They were learning how to turn root into rule, distance into obedience, and scarcity into an engineering problem. They were learning, in short, how to become dangerous in a way the younger races so often are. Not by building more carefully than their elders, but by building faster and then mistaking velocity for entitlement. Tonight we speak of Imaskar, of fertile Raurin before it became the dust desert, of Inupras, the imperial city, of Bukhara spires and the tyranny of solved distance, of artificers who believed that if reality could be folded, then morality could surely be postponed, of the Mulan, who were not migrants, not settlers, not a brave people seeking new horizons under some tiresome imperial hymn, but stolen people, taken through gates from another world to patch a labor shortage. Of a planar barrier erected not merely against rival mages or opportunistic fiends, but against prayer itself. Of what happened when an empire ceased to be satisfied with mastering territory and attempted instead to regulate access between worlds, gods and peoples, as though all three were branches of one administrative department. That is our thesis tonight. Imaskar matters because it reveals a recurring law of the realms. Empire building here rarely stays merely political. In another world, an arrogant state might conquer a valley, enslave a neighboring tribe, and write a legal code thick enough to convince itself that theft has become order. In Faerûn, such things are already bad enough, but the setting adds one unforgiving complication. The cosmos is not absent. The gods are real. The planes are reachable. Portals function. Ancient races have already damaged the world several times over. Magic accumulates. Memory lingers in ruin. When a realm grows grand enough, its crimes begin to touch systems larger than taxation and war. It may offend gods. It may destabilize the landscape. It may invite extraplanar retaliation. It may accidentally turn theology into geopolitics and geopolitics into cosmology. Imaskar did all of that. With style, certainly. Also with catastrophic stupidity. We will begin before the desert, because one must always do so if one wishes to understand the shape of a fall. We will watch the Imaskari rise from tribes on a fertile plain into one of the first great human magical empires of Faerûn. We will examine what made their artificers different from later archwizards, and why their love of portals and extra-dimensional spaces was more than mere sorcery. We will linger over the Empire's central crime, the abduction of the peoples who would become the Mulan, and consider what it does to a civilization when imported labor is not simply bought, but cosmically stolen. We will follow the long silence imposed between the enslaved and their gods. We will look at the Imaskarkana, not as trinkets for optimistic grave robbers, but as a category of lost civilizational technology. We will stand for a little while at the foot of the Godswatch Mountains and listen for the moment when divine patience finally ended. And then we will trace the strange legacy by which the freed slaves of Imaskar did not build a world wholly unlike their masters, but founded Mulhorand and Unther, two of Faerûn's oldest, proudest, and most complicated human empires. This is not an episode about ancient wizards as charming eccentrics with purple stones and a regrettable tendency to over-enchant furniture. Though they did over-enchant the furniture. This is an episode about the moral geometry of power once magic becomes logistical. About what happens when an empire decides that bodies are resources, distance is an inconvenience, and the gods can be barred at the border. Before we open the eastern folios and let the desert in among the candles, a word from the mortal builders of modern systems who, to their credit, achieve scale without abducting a workforce from another world. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions, builders of websites, back-end systems, and technical structures with the rare virtue of remaining functional after the first encounter with reality. If you need clean implementation, thoughtful architecture, or maintenance performed by people who understand that upkeep is part of creation rather than a humiliating sequel to it, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. They build the way ancient empires should have governed, with documentation, foresight, and a commendable refusal to solve staffing shortages by planar kidnapping. Now then, draw the lamp closer. Do not breathe too deeply if the dust begins to taste of bronze. We are going east, to one of the first great human warnings written across Faerûn in purple stone and ash. The first correction required by honesty is geographical. When later adventurers hear the name Faerûn, they think of wasteland, dust desert, desert of desolation, purple skies, ruin-haunted winds, thirsty dragons, stray Efreet, and the sort of horizon that makes optimism look like a consumable resource. All true enough for later ages. None of it is where the story begins. Ancient Imaskar rose on a fertile plain. That matters. A desert empire is easy for the lazy imagination. It suggests severity, discipline, austerity, some splendid fatalism under bright skies. A fertile imperial basin is more dangerous. It means surplus. It means room for administration. It means multiple cities rather than one defiant monument. It means the state has time to become clever. Around -8,350 DR, tribes of Imaskari settled the broad and fertile lands that would much later become the Faerûn Desert. Later chronicles mark this earliest era as the Nemrut period, after the first warlord remembered in their traditions. The beginning is not yet particularly strange by Faerûnian standards. Tribal consolidation, expanding agriculture, chiefs becoming rulers by increments that later historians tidy into inevitability. We have seen similar movements among elves, dwarves, and men elsewhere. But even here, there is an important difference. The Imaskari were early, very early, long before many of the human powers that later crowd the maps with such exhausting confidence. These eastern settlers were already becoming a coherent civilization. And early human civilizations in Faerûn do not inherit an empty stage. Remember where we are in the long argument of the world. The creator races have already left their vast scars. Dragons and giants have already spent epochs proving that apocalyptic grievance can be maintained at scale. The elves have already flowered and bloodied themselves. The dwarves have already begun building under mountain. Ancient roads, magical residues, and broken precedents are all around. To rise early in such a world is not to invent civilization from innocence. It is to assemble a human answer under the pressure of very old debris. Imaskar's answer was artifice. Not mere spellcasting, though they had that in quantities unhealthy even by later standards. Not priesthood, which would never sit comfortably at the empire's heart. Not bloodline glamour, as among certain elf dynasties. Artifice. Applied magical engineering. The habit of asking not simply whether a spell could be cast, but whether a magical principle could be made stable, repeatable, architecturally useful, militarily scalable, and politically central. That habit arrived astonishingly early. By -8,123 DR, Imaskari artificers had created the first permanent extra-dimensional spaces attributed to their civilization. And the record is clear that this quickly transformed their city design. Pause there. This is not a small innovation. A people that can reliably place more space inside a structure than its walls visibly contain has crossed a line. Architecture changes, storage changes, security changes, ceremonial space changes, urban planning changes. The ruler's palace can become less a residence than a folded statement about who gets to command the shape of reality. Corridors may lie, chambers can hold armies, libraries, vaults, laboratories, granaries, shrines, prisons, or all of them in arrangements no ordinary engineer would dare sketch after a sober meal. Imaskar did not merely use magic. It inhabited redesigned assumptions. By -7975 DR, the imperial city of Inupras was founded, and Umyatin, first among the great rulers of the realm, assumed the title of Lord Artificer. That title deserves attention. Not king, not pharaoh, not coronal, not dynast, not high priest, not warlord. Lord Artificer. The empire was announcing in the office of its sovereign what it considered the highest form of legitimacy. Rule in Imaskar was not merely martial or hereditary, it was technical. To govern was to possess mastery over the engineered magical order of the realm. Humans are very dangerous when they begin to confuse competence with permission. Now add to this the Bukhara spires. Throughout the early dynastic period, the artificers raised these great bronze circles, etched with intricate runes, as stable two-way portals capable of moving whole legions swiftly from one domain to another. One can hardly overstate the civilizational effect. The dwarves of Delzoun would later rule circulation by roads hammered patiently beneath mountains. Imaskar solved distance much more abruptly. An army need not march if a gate can swallow it and exhale it where needed. Officials need not merely dispatch messages if access itself can be centralized. Frontiers become more governable. Rebellion becomes harder to localize beyond imperial reach. Trade quickens. Logistics cease to be a humble support function and become the skeleton of sovereignty. This is why I say Imaskar tried to rule access. Many states govern land. Stronger ones govern roads. Imaskar, at its height, governed elsewhere. The empire expanded rapidly across eastern Faerûn. By the end of its early dynastic period, its reach stretched from the Great Ice Sea to the Golden Water, and from the Alamber Sea to the Katakoro Plateau in Karatur. That is an astonishing breadth for any early human realm, and it did not arise because the Imaskari were morally superior, divinely favored, or uniquely disciplined in the sentimental ways patriotic chronicles always prefer. It arose because they possessed magical infrastructure powerful enough to compress the political cost of distance. This is one of the recurring themes of tonight's archive. When a civilization solves a practical problem on a sufficiently grand scale, it very often begins to mistake the solution for evidence of deeper rightness. Imaskar solved movement. Therefore, it assumed it deserved dominion. Such assumptions age badly. Let us linger for a moment in Inupras and the cities of mature early Imaskar, because one learns much from the texture of daily life. The old records and later descriptions agree on several consistent features. Imaskari cities favored a resilient purple stone drawn from the Raurin Mountains. Portals and extra-dimensional spaces were common enough to shape ordinary circulation, not just rare enough to awe visitors. The Palace of the Purple Emperor, best known of their architectural achievements, was remembered as vastly larger within than its outer dimensions suggested. Its interior folded outward through the imperial habit of making room by argument with reality rather than by respectful negotiation with available land. Imagine what this does to a subject's sense of the state. You approach a government building that already appears grand, and upon entering discover that size has become untrustworthy. Rooms unfold beyond external possibility. Guard routes can be concealed in dimensional trickery. Vaults may be nested inside chambers, inside other chambers. A palace ceases to be merely a symbol of authority and becomes a demonstration that authority can manipulate the very terms of expectation. The physical lesson is simple. The empire contains more than you can see, and it controls the means by which you may pass through it. That is political theatre of a very advanced kind, also deeply unsettling, as all effective political theatre tends to be. We know less than I would prefer about the intimate domestic life of ordinary free Imaskari before the slave-taking years, because empires preserve the vanity of their artificers more readily than the routine of their bakers. Still, enough survives to see the shape. Society was hierarchical. The artificers dominated not only as wizards, but as the central class of competence and state prestige. The office of Lord Artificer sat at the summit, but beneath it lay a civilization increasingly organized around magical expertise, technical command, and the imperial bureaucracy necessary to support both. One does not sustain portal networks, extra-dimensional building practices, military deployment by transit gates, and region-wide magical defense without administrators, inspectors, overseers, record keepers, workshop staffs, ward maintainers, and all the unglamorous cadres by which grand designs avoid killing their owners accidentally. There is a lesson there that later arcanists, especially the more theatrical Netherese, would relearn with less grace than they expected. Magic that scales becomes administration. Administration shapes society. So yes, the empire was wondrous. It was also full of clerks with better wards. We catch another glimpse of the Imaskari mind in their dealings with subject peoples. Around -7891 DR, the empire annexed the kobold kingdom of Zextandrim in the Mountains of Copper and demanded tribute. Years later, when the Imaskari concluded that the kobolds had withheld their choicest gems, the response was not merely punitive war in the ordinary fashion. Later records describe the deployment of portal golems and shepherd golems, constructs designed not only to defeat resistance, but to herd whole populations through portals and expel them from their own tunnels. Read that carefully. This is not simply destructive magic, it is logistical violence, population transfer executed as engineered procedure. One begins to see the danger. An empire that treats portals as civic utilities may soon treat peoples as movable inventory. This is why lost tech is too innocent a phrase when spoken without moral memory. Imaskari artifice was brilliant. It was also frequently a method for making domination efficient. Yet early Imaskar was not doomed from birth. I will not indulge that fashionable vice by which all ancient empires are narrated, as if the seeds of every later atrocity are obvious in their first irrigation ditch. History is less neat. The same mastery that enabled coercion also enabled real continuity. Cities were connected. Regions could be governed more coherently than in many later human states. Trade and protection were made possible across enormous distances. Innovation flourished. A civilization able to stabilize such systems truly had accomplished something rare. The archive's duty is not to flatten greatness, because greatness later becomes guilty. It is to remember both at once. And greatness there was. Imaskar had become one of the first human civilizations in Faerûn to think in continental terms without borrowing its identity primarily from a god. That alone is worth noticing. The dwarves had their Maundin Salmon and their clan devotions. The elves were everywhere entangled with the Seldarine, even when pride led them astray. Imaskar, by contrast, increasingly centered human magical competence itself. The ruler was the Lord Artificer. The empire's pathways were portal networks. The capital announced technical mastery. This was a human state beginning to imagine that it could be sufficient unto itself. Such states often become very interested in proving the point. The realms, being what it is, usually lets them try. Before it reached for other worlds, however, Imaskar first discovered a truth every ambitious realm eventually meets. Technical mastery does not exempt one from disaster. Around -6,422 DR, the imperial city of Inupras was razed by rampaging Krakentua. How those demon-haunted horrors entered the city remains uncertain. One later tradition blamed the cult of Demogorgon, claiming the creatures first erupted from the temple of the Gaping Maw near the city's center. Perhaps. The record grows more suggestive than reliable there. What matters is consequence. The destruction of the capital shattered the old imperial balance and split the realm into Upper and Lower Imaskar, ushering in what later historians call the Middle Kingdoms period. Observe the pattern. Even before the great moral catastrophe of the Mulan, Imaskar had already learned that a civilization built on magical control is especially vulnerable when magical control fails in strange ways. A dwarf hall might collapse by flood, tunnel war, or structural neglect. An elf realm might wither by civil fracture, mythal strain, or beautiful incompetence of aristocratic sort. An Imaskari city could be undone by something that made ordinary siege look quaint. Their statecraft had grown entwined with the extraordinary. So did their risks. The natives of Lower Imaskar founded Solon as their new capital and maintained strict central control there. Upper Imaskar centered itself at Thakos in the Katakoro Mountains, a city that later ages would know by another name. Here again, the political imagination of the empire reveals itself. It did not disintegrate, it partitioned, it reconstituted authority through new centers and continued. A lesser people might have read the destruction of Inupras as a cosmic rebuke and moderated. The Imaskari read it as an administrative problem. To be fair, that interpretation often works, until it does not. The Middle Kingdoms lasted for millennia. That is worth saying plainly because it checks another lazy habit of hindsight. One enormous blow did not simply end Imaskar. The split states endured. They adapted. Solon became wealthy enough from iron and position to matter greatly later. Upper Imaskar, protected by mountains and distance, retained its own power base. The machinery of empire survived through alteration. This resilience is impressive. It is also part of what made the later crime possible. A durable state has time to become more dangerous than a fragile one. Then came the silent death. In -4370 DR, a devastating plague racked Lower Imaskar. The timing is precise enough, the results catastrophic enough, and the resonance instructive enough that historians rightly dwell on it. Temples filled with supplicants, but the priests could not cure the afflicted. Worse followed. A blight struck the crops and brought famine to the survivors. Even in the least affected regions, 15 to 20% of the population died. That is not merely sorrow, that is structural shock. Fields empty, workshops understaffed, militias thinned, records disrupted, confidence wounded. The afflicted South endured only because its enemies were themselves weak or distracted. And then, in their bitterness, the people of Lower Imaskar turned against their gods. Most priests were slain or driven into exile. There it is, one of the most revealing turns in all ancient human history. A civilization built around artifice faced a disaster its sacred institutions could not master, and a substantial part of that civilization concluded not that the world was cruel, or that mortality remained undefeated, or that prudence required humility, but that the gods themselves had failed an imperial performance review. Divine authority in Lower Imaskar collapsed under the pressure of unmet expectation. The surviving state did not return to reverence, it hardened in resentment. This is crucial to understanding what followed. Imaskar did not enslave the Mulan because it was conventionally pious and then lapsed. It enslaved them from within a political culture already moving toward the conviction that divine claims were either irrelevant, inadequate, or nuisances to be routed around by more competent minds. Upper Imaskar, interestingly, remained largely untouched. The plague spread north into the lands later called the Endless Wastes, but the eastern highlands were spared the worst. Thus, the empire's bifurcation acquired a spiritual asymmetry as well as a geographic one. Lower Imaskar suffered plague, famine, priestly failure, and social bitterness. Upper Imaskar retained comparative security. The two halves were already politically separated. Now they were being taught different lessons by catastrophe. One learns a great deal about a civilization by observing which lesson eventually triumphs. In Lower Imaskar, Lord Artificer Khotan faced the obvious problem. He had too few people, too little labor, too much land and infrastructure to sustain. The fields still required hands, the workshops still required bodies. The state still required taxes, roads, maintenance, military service, and all the lowly continuities by which governments avoid dissolving into nostalgic rhetoric. Here, a more limited ruler might have retrenched. He might have narrowed the realm. He might have renegotiated with surviving neighboring peoples. He might even, had he been both imaginative and just, have reconsidered the assumptions of the imperial order and built anew with those who remained. He was an Imaskari Lord Artificer. He commissioned 2 new Bukhara spires, and in -4366 DR, artificers opened twin gates to another world whose people possessed no command of the art. This, my apprentice, is the hinge on which the whole episode turns. Read the action with proper moral grammar. The Imaskari did not discover a new land and then fight a war, however unjust. They did not accept refugees. They did not invite laborers with promises of pay and land. They did not even conduct the ordinary villainy of slave raids against neighboring tribes within the same world, though they were perfectly capable of such things. They opened transworld portals into another reality and abducted human beings en masse for use as labor stock. Not merely conquest, procurement. That distinction is ugly, and it is exact. Over the next 4 centuries, the Imaskari carried out repeated abductions through those twin gates. Tens of thousands of humans were taken and brought to Faerûn as slaves. The records preserved through later Mulhorandi and Untheric traditions make clear that these captives came from at least 2 great cultural streams tied to different divine patrons and, according to some traditions, from different lands and even different periods on their home world. I do not press too hard on the speculative edges of that puzzle here. It is enough to say that the stolen did not arrive as one people and remain unchanged. They were mixed under bondage, worked under alien skies, and over generations intermarried among themselves and with the Imaskari. Their descendants would become, in time, the Mulan. We must be careful with words now. Origin stories are treacherous things. Later, empires loved to describe themselves as arising from destiny, chosenness, heroic migration, or the providential gathering of peoples under wise leadership. The Mulan origin is not that sort of story. It begins in theft. It passes through forced labor. It develops under metaphysical isolation. The Mulan do become a people in their own right. History can and does create real identities out of violent beginnings, but one must not let the reality of the later people soften the nature of the original act. They were stolen people, stolen to repair an imperial labor deficit. That sentence should remain ugly. Imaskar had done something more monstrous than expanding too far. It had turned a demographic problem into a portal solution. The empire looked at depopulation, saw vacant fields and interrupted production, and decided that another world's inhabitants were a recoverable resource. There is a particular kind of imperial mind revealed there, one not content merely to exploit what lies within reach, but eager to redefine reach until morality can no longer hide behind geography. You see now why I insisted earlier that in Faerûn, empire building often acquires cosmic consequences. Here the state did not merely wrong its neighbors, it trespassed across worlds, nor did the Imaskari stop at bodies. Once the abducted were in Faerûn, the artificers erected a great planar barrier to prevent contact between the slaves and their deities. This is among the coldest acts in all the ancient histories, precisely because it is so methodical. The Imaskari understood that faith could sustain resistance, prayer could attract aid, divine power, if permitted access, might become insurgency, miracle, or war. So the empire did what administrators always dream of when frightened by realities larger than themselves. It tried to regulate transcendence. Imagine the cruelty from below. You are taken from one world into another. Your language is fragmented among strangers and kin alike. Your labor is no longer yours. Your children are born under a different sky. And when you call upon the gods who knew your people before the abduction, no answer comes. Not because the gods are false, not because your devotion has failed, because the empire has, by conscious design, attempted to mute the channel. There are many forms of tyranny. This one sought jurisdiction over silence. Now, I am not so theatrical a fool as to claim the barrier meant that every Mulan slave spent every evening in elaborate theological despair. Peoples under bondage still eat, labor, quarrel, love, bear children, negotiate petty advantage, keep family memory alive in fragments, and learn the thousand practices by which the oppressed remain human despite a state's best effort to reduce them to function. History is not sustained by abstractions alone. Somewhere in Lower Imaskar, there were Mulan mothers teaching words from lost homelands to children who would answer in accents their grandmothers would find strange. Somewhere field gangs cursed in blended tongues. Somewhere an overseer's household contained servants who knew exactly how much deference to perform and how much hatred to hide. Somewhere a scribe of mixed descent was quietly beginning to see that the categories master and subject were becoming less biologically tidy than imperial vanity preferred. Empires never enjoy that realization. And because the Mulan did not remain static cargo, the moral problem deepened. Over time, they intermarried with one another and with the Imaskari, becoming an ethnicity in their own right. In other words, the empire's labor solution began generating a new people inside its own social order. Not citizens in the full sense, not free partners in the imperial bargain. A people produced by domination, yet not reducible to it. That is one of history's most dangerous developments for a ruling class built on hierarchy. Once the enslaved are no longer foreign in any simple way, the empire must either integrate, exterminate, permanently stratify, or learn to live beside a contradiction that grows larger with every generation. Imaskar chose stratification and magical suppression. The contradiction continued growing. And here at last we begin to approach the older question I set before you. What sort of thing did Imaskar think an empire was? The answer becomes clearer with every page. A dwarven realm at its best is a compact of obligations under stone. An elven realm at its most glorious and most brittle is a continuity of beauty, blood, and magical refinement. Imaskar imagined empire as an engineered system of throughput. Goods, troops, knowledge, commands, and later bodies themselves moving through design channels. The Bukhara spires solved transport. The extra-dimensional chambers solved storage and space. The artificers solved military deployment. The barrier solved divine interference. The Mulan supplied the labor deficit. Do you hear the hidden premise? Everything is a problem to be solved. Route, solved. Distance, solved. Space, solved. Population, solved. Gods, solved. When a civilization begins speaking that way long enough, it will eventually try to solve something that answers back. For a time, astonishingly, the system worked. The massive influx of coerced labor restored productivity and prosperity to Lower Imaskar. The empire did not collapse under the moral weight of what it had done, because history rarely offers so comforting an arrangement. Instead, it recovered. Crops returned, workshops filled, administrators produced figures that must have looked marvelously reassuring beside the plague years. A civilization that had stared into demographic ruin found itself once more expanding in confidence. It is difficult to imagine a more dangerous lesson for an unjust state than immediate practical success. 4 centuries after the first great abductions, Lower and Upper Imaskar were reunified under the strong hand of Lord Artificer Omanond, and Inupras was restored as the sole capital. Thus began the late period of Imaskar, lasting from -3920 DR until the empire's violent end in -2488 DR. You may feel the recovered confidence in that date range alone. More than 1,000 years of renewed imperial life, reunified government, restored capital, mended prestige, technical brilliance again at the center. Had you visited then, I suspect many of the empire's defenders would have pointed to this long stability as proof that their hard choices had been vindicated. Historians are very often invited to admire duration by people unwilling to discuss price. Under Omanon's orders, the artificers created the Imaskar, 7 great artifacts in which the Empire's immense magical lore was recorded for all eternity. The phrase itself is instructive, recorded for all eternity. There is something at once magnificent and faintly comic about the confidence. One hears not simply practical archiving, but civilizational vanity attempting to petrify itself into permanence. Yet we should not mock too quickly. The Imaskar were no ordinary treasures. They represented an extraordinary idea that the core magical knowledge of an empire could be condensed, stabilized, and carried in a distributed set of supreme objects, portable enough to survive catastrophe and potent enough to function as civilizational seed if the rest were lost. This is where the common phrase, lost technology, begins to fail us. It makes the Imaskar sound like curios recovered from rubble by cheerful specialists with brushes. No, they are better understood as portable state memory. The Imaskari had already built portals, folded space, militarized mobility, and reworked architecture according to extra-dimensional principles. The Imaskar formalized that civilizational knowledge at the highest level. They were not all books, despite the assumption of some later treasure seekers whose imagination begins and ends in libraries. They were varied devices of differing forms, each storing lore in its own fashion. Surviving accounts agree that they were among the greatest artifacts the Empire ever produced. Later traditions identify particular members of the set with distinct bodies of knowledge. The 7th, for instance, was said to contain the whole of Imaskari knowledge concerning the creation of permanent extra-dimensional spaces. Other surviving notices suggest that each Imaskar conferred magical protections, could be commanded only in the Imaskari tongue of Rushum, and retaliated violently when addressed improperly by the ignorant. A very civilized touch. Even their archives punished bad pronunciation. What matters most for our purposes is not the itemization of powers, though adventurers and collectors will inevitably continue debasing themselves over such matters. What matters is the category. An Imaskar is not a wand, not a relic of a single hero, not the jeweled toy of one extravagant sorcerer. It is a node of imperial method, something made to preserve and transmit the procedures by which Imaskar reshaped reality. When I speak of Imaskar as a lost tech category, this is what I mean. Not ancient gadgets, a phrase fit only for drunks and optimists. I mean artifacts that encoded institutional knowledge so powerful that later ages would recover not merely spells from them, but ways of thinking. and ways of thinking are far more dangerous than weapons. A sword can kill one fool. A recoverable system can teach generations how to repeat him. You can see this pattern throughout the wider remnants of Imaskari artifice. The Palace of the Purple Emperor, greatest known example of their folded architecture, stood larger within than without, its interior serving as vault, residence, and arcane machine at once. Fortresses employed extra-dimensional chambers not as novelties, but as tactical expectations. Portals were embedded into the logic of war and administration. Constructs such as portal golems and shepherd golems reveal a design philosophy in which engineering and coercion cooperated intimately. Even obscure ruins from later ages preserve hints of research installations, hidden sublevels, hewn purple stone, and rooms made impossible by transmutation. Imaskar Khana, in the broadest sense, therefore denotes more than 7 artifacts. It evokes an entire imperial technological disposition. The belief that reality may be organized through repeatable magical systems, archived, reproduced, and turned into civic force. If that sounds like a bridge between dwarf infrastructure and Netherese arcana to come, you are listening properly. Imaskar stands in that genealogical middle. The dwarves built continuity through engineering under stone. Imaskar built imperial reach through arcane systems. Netheril, when we arrive there, will make magic the public utility of an elite culture so thoroughly that daily life itself begins to float. Each civilization teaches the next something. They do not always intend the lesson. During this late period, other names rise from the archive. Madrioch the Ibn Flame, who was exploring and cataloguing the plane of shadow 3 millennia before later human arcane traditions liked to congratulate themselves on fresh discovery. Hilatha, young prodigy and formidable artificer who opposed Madrioch when the latter sought to seize the empire by weaponizing such knowledge. The frontier fortress of Metos, seat of that confrontation and proof that even restored Imaskar required outposts and military edges, not just splendid capitals. The details matter because they show that mature Imaskar was never merely a placid machine humming beneath a stable palace. It was intellectually ferocious, ambitious at the edges of known magical cosmology, and full of internal rivalries of the familiar imperial kind. Its greatest minds did not all agree on how far power should go, only on the assumption that it could go much farther than lesser peoples imagined. Here too, one sees a subtle difference between Imaskar and certain later human states. The Netherese will make celebrity of genius. Their names will shimmer with that peculiar combination of scholarship and vanity unique to floating societies. Imaskar feels colder, more institutional. Its wonders matter less because one mage thought them pretty, and more because the empire could absorb them into method. Madrioch's work in shadow, Hilatha's counter, the crafting of the Imaskar Khana, the development of extra-dimensional urbanism, the maintenance of trans-regional portal networks. All these suggest a civilization where magic had advanced beyond court performance into state competency. Now ask yourself what daily life feels like inside such a state at its height. Not for the Lord Artificer first. He is easy. Palace chambers larger within than without, guards routed through hidden dimensional corridors, councils meeting under ceilings no external survey could predict. a crown or other regnal device whose value lies not merely in jewelry, but in retained magical authority. Access to the best artificers, the oldest runic schemata, the most potent wards, perhaps even one of the Imaskar at hand, to remind visitors that the state literally wears its archive. More interesting is the life below that summit. A merchant in Inupras lives amid a city where doors may be farther than they appear, where storehouses contain more than their walls declare, where official inspection can arrive with unnerving rapidity if portals are involved, and where taxation, licensing, and transport all occur inside a system increasingly saturated with magic. A skilled craftsman works in an environment where arcane devices are not rare spectacles, but part of the upper order of reality, even if he himself cannot command them. A soldier marches not only roads, but transit architecture. A clerk is trained to think dimensionally and procedurally at once. A servant of the palace learns that some rooms must never be entered without the right token, some corridors close upon the unlicensed, and some commands only answer if spoken in Rushum with proper inflection, because the empire has coded language itself into access. No wonder the Imaskari became haughty. They lived in a world continually demonstrating that their civilization could modify the expected relationship between matter, movement, and authority. Pride becomes very easy in such conditions. So too does blindness. And blindness in mature empires rarely means inability to perceive facts. More often it means perceiving facts through a lens so flattering that one cannot imagine their moral arrangement as contingent. The Imaskari knew they had enslaved a foreign labor force. They knew they had blocked contact with those people's gods. They knew their prosperity partly rested on that arrangement. What they did not permit themselves to feel with sufficient seriousness was that the arrangement might be unstable precisely because it worked too well. A slave population that restores an empire is not merely a tool, it is a new center of gravity inside the state. A suppressed deity is not necessarily defeated. A barrier erected by mortals is not always beyond the patience or ingenuity of powers who measure time differently, which is why the empire's greatest confidence and its greatest vulnerability grew together. The more prosperous Imaskar became, the more its rulers could tell themselves that the Mulan barrier was final, that prayer had been reduced to noise, that imported peoples had been naturalized into utility, that the state had not only survived its crisis, but transcended old constraints. Under such assumptions, even piety becomes something one can mock as provincial. Why fear divine retaliation when centuries have passed and the harvest accounts remain healthy? Why imagine the stolen will ever become anything but governed? Why suppose another world will matter if you have successfully turned it into a labor reservoir? That, more than wickedness alone, is the special danger of technocratic arrogance. It encourages long-running experiments in dehumanization by rewarding them in practical increments. I should say here, because truth is more valuable than satisfying denunciation, that the Mulan were not the only living inheritance reshaped by the late empire. The Imaskari also preserved and transmitted knowledge that later successor cultures would carry in unexpected directions. Their language, Rushum, would stand ancestral to several Eastern tongues. Their eastern provinces would survive the Western Empire's fall and continue as Imaskar, a crucial precursor in the long histories later associated with Sholung. Their underground refugees would create deep Imaskar, hoarding memory and artifacts beneath the world rather than surrendering them to dust. Even Solon, capital of old Lower Imaskar, would try for a time to carve a new desert polity from the ruins. This matters because it prevents us from narrating the empire as a neat moral parable with one explosion at the end. Imaskar was guilty, yes. It was also fertile in consequence. The realms does not often permit clean endings. It prefers afterlives. Still, if one seeks the clearest symbol of late Imaskari self-understanding, I return to the Imaskarkana. Think of the audacity. 7 objects, each storing bodies of lore and empire, judged central enough to preserve against oblivion. Not merely protecting knowledge in libraries, but embodying it in supreme devices. Even now, I can hear some overeager collector in a southern ruin muttering about market value and recoverability. Resist that provincial habit. The better question is this: what kind of civilization creates its crown jewels as backups for reality management? An anxious one, a brilliant one. A state already conscious that great systems require survivable redundancy. Such awareness is admirable. It is also often a sign that the rulers understand, somewhere beneath the pride, how much they have built that could yet fail. And fail it did, though not in the way the artificers expected. For centuries, the Mulan prayed into managed silence. There is a terrible sophistication in that phrase, managed silence. Empires adore it. They call it order, stability, pacification, proper channels, religious settlement, border discipline, lawful restraint, or any number of bureaucratic perfumes designed to conceal the fact that someone has deliberately arranged for another people's cry to go unanswered. The Imaskari barrier was one of the grandest examples in all the old annals. Mortals, using mortal magic, had imposed a kind of quarantine between a stolen population and the powers that had shaped its previous world. But the realms does not flatter mortal jurisdiction forever. The prayers of the Mulan were heard by Ao, the overgod, who summoned Ta and charged him with carrying word to the deities of the stolen peoples. Because the barrier barred easy divine entry, the gods could not simply stroll through it in their fullness. They were compelled to adopt a more arduous solution. Powerful avatars, called manifestations in the old accounts, would have to be fashioned and physically brought through the void between worlds. It is one of the more splendidly strange episodes in Faerûnian theology, and therefore one of my favorites. The Empire had built a magical fence around prayer. The gods answered by turning an act of rescue into an intercosmic expedition. There is something almost dryly comic in that, if you have the right temperament. Imagine the memoranda. Barrier holds against standard divine ingress. Very well, said reality, then we shall arrive by ship. Traditions differ in decorative detail, but the broad outline is consistent. Ta, master of planar travel, guided the gods of the Mulan through the vastness between spheres. The Mulhorandi powers came in a vessel remembered as Matet, the Unteric powers in another remembered as the galley of the gods. They landed upon the heights of the Taylor Shan, later called the God's Watch Mountains, on the northeastern edge of Imaskar. There, because even manifestations were not the most efficient instruments for stirring revolt among dispersed slaves, the gods divided themselves further into lesser avatars known as incarnations. These mortal-seeming forms descended among the Mulan. The most devout were made priests. The most faithful were transformed into divine minions. Hope, long denied formal access, re-entered the empire not as sermon, but as organized insurrection under supernatural leadership. One should pause to appreciate the strategic elegance. The Imaskari had built a state of controlled channels. The divine response met them not with one thunderbolt from nowhere, but with infiltration, organization, local empowerment, and then open war. The gods did not merely smash the barrier and declare victory. They reconstituted political agency among the stolen people. They made rebels, clergy, champions, and leaders. If that seems like a very godlike understanding of empire, it is because gods in the realms are forced by circumstance to become excellent students of social structure. They cannot answer all cries equally. When they do intervene, it is rarely random. The better deities aim at leverage. At first, the rebellion did not simply sweep all before it. Many incarnations and divine minions were destroyed fighting Imaskari forces. The empire still possessed formidable artificers, powerful constructs, disciplined infrastructures of response, and the habits of command ingrained across generations. One must not imagine the Great Revolt as a neat morality play in which oppressed virtue automatically defeated technical mastery. The Mulan bled, the gods' mortal agents died, resistance faltered. That is how real revolt often looks before posterity edits it for school children. Then the manifestations themselves descended. Later traditions remember the path from the mountains as the road of the gods. Along it came powers long barred from their faithful, moving now in forms crafted precisely to answer the Empire's presumption. This is the moment the episode's central law becomes impossible to ignore. Imaskar had tried to solve the divine as an administrative inconvenience. The divine replied in person, not abstractly, not through omens alone, by arrival. Within 10 days, many of the Empire's major cities were sacked. Here it is worth rejecting two opposite temptations. Do not romanticize the destruction as pure justice without remainder. Cities are made of more than their ruling ideology. Ordinary people die in sackings, some guilty, many merely near power. At the same time, do not sentimentalize the empire into tragic innocence, overwhelmed by irrational gods. The catastrophe was not arbitrary. It had been invited, shaped, and intensified by centuries of magical arrogance, slave-taking, and deliberate theological strangulation. If you build a state on stolen bodies and blocked prayers, the eventual answer will not be gentle. The final confrontation took place on the steps of the palace in Inupras between Horus and Lord Artificer Yuvaraj, last ruler of ancient Imaskar. Horus emerged victorious. Some later traditions linger on the regalia. Yuvaraj rode to war upon a copper dragon. He wore the first Imaskar Kana as a crown and bore another great artifact of the set. The details are suitably grand, but what interests me is not the spectacle. It is the symbolism. The Lord Artificer, crowned with the archive of imperial magical mastery, standing upon the steps of a palace folded beyond ordinary space, facing a god who had crossed the void specifically because the empire believed gods could be excluded. There are few more exact images of overreach. A crown of preserved knowledge is still a crown. And crowns do not save those who have mistaken capability for sovereignty over everything. In minus 2488 DR, the Empire of Imaskar fell. The battles between the manifestations of the Mulhorandi and Untheric pantheons and the artificers of Imaskar devastated the fertile basin so thoroughly that Raurin was transformed into wasteland. Later ages would know it as the Dust Desert. The magical and divine violence of that collapse also gave rise to the Plains of Purple Dust, that haunted region where the ruins of the Empire remain half-buried in faintly magical sands. Some later accounts add that the victorious god-kings summoned spirits of retribution to scour what the war had left unbroken, and that these terrible presences lingered in the wastes thereafter, rising in packs every century. Whether you take that literally, metaphorically, or as half-remembered encounter with something worse than either, the moral image is apt enough. The land itself became a rebuke. This is what cosmic consequence looks like in the realms. Not merely a defeated army, a geography rewritten. The thing one must resist, however, is treating the fall as a divine tantrum draped in spectacular scenery. It was more specific than that. Imaskar had committed 3 linked errors. First, it believed technical success entitled it to imperial rule over vast regions. Second, when crisis came, it treated another world's people as importable labor. Third, it attempted to suppress the spiritual relations of those stolen people by arcane quarantine. Each error escalated the scale of the next. Conquest led to confidence. Confidence led to abduction. Abduction led to the barrier. The barrier brought the gods into the story in a direct way. Once gods arrive bodily in a setting where magic already saturates architecture and governance, the land itself becomes vulnerable to becoming collateral in an argument between metaphysical orders. That is why I call Imaskar a great human warning. Not because magic is evil. Such simplicities are for village preachers and dull paladins. Not because empire is unique to humans. Every long-lived people in Faerûn has, at one time or another, discovered the pleasures of imposing itself upon neighbors. It is a warning because Imaskar shows how human speed, magical ingenuity, and administrative ambition can combine into a polity willing to treat the very fabric of relation, between peoples, between worlds, between mortals and gods, as a technical field for unilateral redesign. Astonishing. Also doomed. Notice too the peculiar cruelty of timing. The gods do not arrive at the first theft. They do not descend the first year the gates are opened. They come centuries later, long enough for the empire to normalize its crime, long enough for several generations of Mulan to be born into bondage under a silence they did not choose, long enough for the rulers of Imaskar to mistake delayed consequence for safety. This is one of history's harshest habits. Retribution rarely keeps the schedule of conscience. By the time it comes, the guilty are interwoven with those who merely inherited the system. Hence, the destruction is always more than an equation. The empire falls. Children still lose homes. Ruins become inhabited by things no original citizen ever approved. Memory hardens into mutual accusation. And yet the answer still had to come. There are some who argue that Imaskar's downfall proves the superiority of priestly order over arcane ambition. They usually wish to be invited to dinner by the clergy. I advise skepticism. Mulhorand and Unther, founded by gods and governed by manifestations, would in time produce tyrannies, rigidities, slavery, priestly rivalries, and imperial wars of their own. Divine rescue does not sterilize politics. The lesson is not that gods are safe and wizards are not. The lesson is that an empire which tries to monopolize access to the sacred while exploiting the stolen faithful of absent deities is engaging in a form of provocation larger than itself. Another mistaken lesson says that Imaskar fell because it offended the wrong gods, implying that a more diplomatically pious version of slavery might have endured. Those who offer this opinion should be set to copying burial accounts until their cleverness improves. The deeper issue was not merely offense, it was dehumanization encoded at civilizational scale. The barrier made the offense metaphysical, yes, but the abduction itself had already rendered the empire morally diseased. The gods arriving did not create the rot. They exposed and answered it. One also sees here a truth about prayer in the realms that later cynical ages often forget. Prayer is not always immediate petition. Often it is continuity. A people remembers itself through the names it addresses in suffering. The Imaskari understood this well enough to target it. By keeping the stolen people's gods out, they were trying not only to deny miracles, but to dissolve historical identity over generations. Had the barrier remained absolute forever, the Mulan might still have become a new people, but one severed more completely from antecedent patronage and memory. The gods' arrival therefore restored more than military possibility. It restored genealogy of meaning. When later Mulhorandi or Untheric nobles claimed ancient right, some portion of that claim rested on this intervention. Their peoples had not merely overthrown a master, they had been answered across worlds. That is an inheritance with teeth, and it produced not one successor, but several. The Mulan moved westward from the devastated basin in the years after Imaskar's fall. They did not instantly produce two polished empires with matching chronologies and decorative state theology ready for tourism. Liberation is seldom that tidy. There were generations of migration, settlement, conflict, and consolidation between the fall of the empire and the formal founding moments later marked in calendars. Meanwhile, Imaskari refugees fled in other directions. Some survivors escaped into the Underdark, carrying at least one of the Imaskar with them. Lord Ilfamon and his followers would eventually found Deep Imaskar below the surface. In the eastern provinces, protected by distance and terrain, the successor state of Anok Imaskar arose under Kujawa and would become, in the long perspective, a precursor of Sholung. Solon, old capital of Lower Imaskar, also sought to shape a post-imperial life in the spreading desert. Even here, the realms refuses neat endings. A wicked empire may fall and still leave 3 or 4 inheritances arguing over its bones. This complicates justice. It also makes history worth studying. If all the evil simply vanished and all the virtue immediately arranged itself into constitutional harmony, I would have retired centuries ago. Let us therefore follow the stolen into their afterlives. One of the easiest mistakes in old empires' lore is to imagine Mulhorand and Unther as simple vindications. The slaves are freed, the gods prevail, the wicked wizards are cast down, and behold, righteous nations. The outline flatters priests and bores historians. What actually emerges is stranger, richer, and much more useful. The former slaves of Imaskar did not merely escape bondage. They inherited the burden of building states in the wreckage left by the war that freed them. The land they had first known in Faerûn was devastated. Raurin was becoming desert. Imaskari cities lay in ruin or partial occupation. The gods who had crossed the void to answer their prayers did not intend to remain abstract patrons from a safely inaccessible heaven. They were physically present in manifestation. They had created incarnations, divine minions, and priesthoods among the Mulan. They had led rebellion, commanded armies, and now stood before a people who needed order, food, settlement, defense, and legitimacy. This is how liberation begins to harden into statehood. Not by becoming morally uncomplicated, by becoming administratively necessary. The Mulan moved westward to the shores of the Alumbar Sea. Generations later, in -2135 DR, Re founded the city of Skuld, soon capital of a new nation called Mulhorand. In -2087 DR, Enlil founded Unthalas, city of gems, which became the capital of Unther. The dates matter because they remind us that nearly 4 centuries separate the fall of Imaskar from the formal founding of these 2 great successor states. That long interval is often hurried past by storytellers in love with clean causation. Resist them. Those centuries are the measure of how difficult it is to turn rescued populations into durable polities. A divine victory is not a civil service. Temples do not automatically irrigate fields. A manifestation can slay a Lord Artificer, but someone must still decide where granaries go. And because the gods of the Mulan remained near, the resulting empires developed unlike almost anything else in Faerûn. For many generations, the powerful manifestations of the Mulhorandi and Untheric pantheons ruled as god-kings, while their incarnations and descendant lines filled the ranks of noble and priestly authority. This gave both realms extraordinary coherence. Their founding myth was not merely remembered. It was embodied in the continuing presence of rulers who had personally participated in liberation or directly descended from those who had. That kind of legitimacy is intoxicating. It is also perilous. Let us begin with Mulhorand. Mulhorand is one of the oldest surviving human nations in all Faerûn, and one of the clearest examples of how a people can build continuity out of trauma without thereby becoming innocent of new cruelties. The people of Mulhorand remained primarily Mulan, but their realm also absorbed other populations over time, including Turami and, in later eras, large numbers of slaves from Thai. Their language remained strikingly true to the tongue the Mulan had spoken upon arriving in Faerûn, preserving pictographic forms and older cultural memory with a fidelity many other human nations would have lost in half the time. Their capital, Skuld, retained its status so long that later ages rightly regarded it as the oldest continuously inhabited city in Faerûn. Already you can hear the old note of legitimacy. We endured. Mulhorand organized itself as a theocracy. The clergy of the Mulhorandi pantheon governed in layers, with the Church of Horus Re foremost in power. Law was central to the self-image of the people. Change was treated with suspicion. Priests received immense public honor. Public prayers were woven into ordinary life. Even the wealthy planned their tombs carefully, preparing for death as an extension of civic and spiritual order rather than an embarrassing interruption to property ownership. The state was old, ceremonially dense, and convinced that continuity itself was virtue. And here the shadow of Imaskar becomes visible in a way many well-meaning admirers prefer not to examine. Mulhorand never entirely forgot it had been enslaved. Neither did it entirely stop using slavery. That is the wound. Mulhorand's social order included a caste system. Nobles served as priests, wizards, or bureaucrats. A middling class of landowners and craftsmen existed, but the majority of the population fell into slavery. These slaves were owned by the temples, rented out for labor, and formally guaranteed humane treatment by law. Abuse could be punished. The priesthood of Osiris held some responsibility for oversight. A master who killed a slave might face capital punishment. Some slaves were educated and used within bureaucracy. Many worked temple-owned farms. The arrangement was, in comparative terms, less overtly brutal than slavery in certain other lands. It was still slavery. There is a particular irony in that. A people born in part from cosmic theft built one of the realm's most durable theocratic orders and preserved within it a humane system of bondage justified by law, tradition, and divine hierarchy. The slaves of Mulhorand could even become proud of their status relative to foreign slaves, believing themselves held in service not by mere mortals, but under the care of the gods through temple stewardship. You see how dangerous old wounds can become when institutionalized rather than healed. Mulhorand did not reproduce Imaskar exactly. That would be a foolish simplification. It did not steal masses of people from another world through portal raids, nor did it erect barriers between enslaved populations and their gods. But it did preserve the idea that a great state may be hierarchically ordered under sacred authority, and that the labor of the many may be bound to the purposes of the whole. It replaced the technocratic arrogance of the Lord Artificers with the moral gravity of god-kings and priesthoods. For many Mulhorandi, this genuinely produced stability, law, education, ritual continuity, and a recognizable civilization in which life could be orderly and even dignified. For many others, especially those at the bottom, it meant that old liberation had become a story used to justify current subordination. History can be cruel in exactly that way. A people remembers what was done to them, then teaches themselves, with subtle distinctions and polished ceremony, why doing something adjacent to others is not the same thing at all. Mulhorand's virtues were real. Its arrogance was real. Its legalism was real. Its priestly rivalries were real. The different churches of the pantheon bickered, struggled, and maneuvered against one another, even while maintaining the outward stability of the realm. The state presented itself as ordered continuity under divine favor, yet within that order, clergies competed for influence, temples accumulated power, and the line between spiritual duty and political office remained comfortably blurred for those at the top. Again, none of this is unusual by Faerûnian standards. The unusual part is how old the structure is, and how directly it remembers the rescue from Imaskar as one of its foundational warrants. In Mulhorand, therefore, the legacy of Imaskar becomes paradoxical. The empire of stolen people gives birth to a realm obsessed with law, piety, ancestry, and stable custom. The answer to technocratic overreach becomes theocratic duration. The state's great strength is precisely the thing that can render it inflexible. Law is paramount, change is avoided. The people consider themselves superior to rivals. Their clergy expect deference. Their dead are planned for elaborately. Their old language persists. Their state remembers. All of this can be admirable. All of it can also curdle into complacency. Mulhorand becomes, in a sense, the opposite answer to Imaskar, using some of the same imperial instincts. If Imaskar said, "The clever may rewrite the world," Mulhorand answered, "The lawful and divinely ordered may preserve it." Both answers can dominate neighbors. Both answers can forget how it feels at the bottom. Now consider Unda. If Mulhorand preserved rescue as law, Untha preserved rescue as sovereignty sharpened by pride. Untha began under the rule of its own god-kings, and like Mulhorand, grew prosperous and highly magical. It warred against local populations, expanded aggressively, and soon found itself in rivalry with the other great Mulan successor state born from the same liberation. This alone is one of the archive's more bitter amusements. Two peoples stolen by the same empire, freed by different but allied pantheons at the same great breaking point, proceed not to cultivate grateful fraternity for the next several millennia, but to define one another as imperial rivals. You may take from that whatever lesson about human politics seems most profitable. I assure you the stone has already taken its own. By -1967 DR, Mulhorand and Untha clashed at the River of Swords in the First Mulhorand-Untha War. Mercenaries from Rashemen, Raumvir, Sossel and the Narlands were hired by both sides. In -1961 DR, their god-kings agreed upon a border at the River of Swords. Note the pattern. Even early in their life, both successor empires had already learned a rule that many later powers relearn expensively. Shared trauma is not sufficient basis for lasting alliance. Similar origin can produce rivalry as easily as solidarity, especially when each state believes its gods, rituals, and political order are the truer continuation of divine favor. Untha's later history takes on a darker cast still. After Enlil departed Toril, Gilgim became supreme ruler, and the long Second Empire of Untha followed. Over time, Gilgim grew corrupted by power, and with him the nobility. The country, which had begun more benevolently, became increasingly infamous as one of the most miserable tyrannies in Faerûn. Nobles concentrated authority, often serving as priests, wizards, or bureaucrats. They were few in number, tightly guarded in bloodline, and deeply invested in Mulan purity. Slavery flourished harshly. Demi-humans were often enslaved outright. Families who fell from favor might be reduced into bondage. Law remained a favored word of the regime, but the ruling class had little regard for human life and less for non-human lives. Common people lived more to survive than to prosper. This, too, is part of Imaskar's afterlife. The rescued become rulers. Rulers become old. Old rulers become convinced their continued dominance is identical with order. Soon enough, a realm founded in divine deliverance is enforcing martial misery on people who may scarcely remember, except as holy pageant, why the first rebellion mattered. Unther therefore represents another kind of legacy empire, not the stable ceremonial conservatism of Mulhorand, but the long decay of liberation into sullen divine absolutism. Its armies were later judged old-fashioned, its tactics stale, its equipment archaic by comparison with younger powers. Yet old-fashioned is not the same as harmless. A tyrannical old empire carries enormous inertia. It has symbols, calendars, sacred geography, inherited fear, and habits of obedience sedimented through generations. Even when weakened, it remains difficult to uproot because its power is not only military. It is mythic in the technical sense, woven into what people imagine the land itself to be. If Mulhorand shows how old rescue can become lawful hierarchy, Unther shows how old rescue can become grievance enthroned. Neither state can be understood without Imaskar, and neither state can be reduced to its relationship with Imaskar once time has had centuries to work. This is why I resist sentimental genealogies. Some readers, especially the kind who confuse sympathy with truth, want a later people to remain morally legible solely through its founding wound. They wish to say, the Mulan was stolen, therefore Mulhorand and Unther must be essentially righteous insofar as they carry that memory. No. Founding trauma explains much. It does not canonize what comes after. Mulhorand can be stable, pious, impressive, and still bound to slavery. Unther can be old, culturally rich, and still become an engine of Gilgeim's paranoia. History is not a moral annuity. The same complexity appears in the role of the divine manifestations and incarnations themselves. For many generations, these rulers and their kindred governed both empires directly or through continued embodied presence. This gave Mulhorand and Unther a theological intimacy almost unknown elsewhere in Faerûn. Later people did not merely believe their gods were watching. They saw their god-kings, obeyed their commands, watched their priesthoods shape law, and built calendars around their reigns. The benefit was extraordinary legitimacy and cohesion. The cost was equally extraordinary difficulty in distinguishing politics from sacred inevitability. That, too, is a lesson the realms repeats. A society whose gods are too close may become as rigid as one whose rulers think themselves gods by other means. Imaskar denied divine proximity by force. Mulhorand and Unther institutionalized it. Neither arrangement preserved freedom automatically. And yet, to leave the matter there would be unfair. These legacy empires were not empty hypocrisy wrapped around old rescue. They produced real cultural worlds. Mulhorandi tomb architecture, ritual life, language, public devotion, and administrative seriousness endured across ages that would have broken lesser states. Untheric identity, despite tyranny, remained tenacious enough to survive repeated humiliation, conquest, magical catastrophe, displacement to Abir, and return. These are not negligible accomplishments. A people does not last that long merely by shouting about ancestry. Something meaningful is being transmitted. Story, form, law, family structure, foodways, holy days, speech, expectation. The old conviction that this land is ours because our gods crossed worlds for us. It is a potent inheritance. It can steady, it can imprison. Often both. The legacy of Imaskar also reappears in subtler ways. Consider language. Mulhorandi remained notably faithful to the old Mulan tongue, preserving continuity with the speech of those first abducted peoples. Untheric diverged over the centuries until the kinship grew harder to hear, a small but telling sign of how two sibling civilizations can answer time differently. Consider political office. In both realms, nobles and priests intertwined deeply with governance. But Mulhoran's priestly complexity produced one texture of power, while Unther's narrowing around Gilgeam produced another. Consider slavery. Both retained it, yet under radically different moral clothing, temple-regulated and comparatively bounded in Mulhorand, brutal and status-degrading in Unther. Consider self-image. Mulhorand imagined itself old law and divine order. Unther imagined itself old sovereignty and wounded greatness. These are not minor variations, they are entire civilizational temperaments, and both began with stolen ancestors walking west out of a broken magical empire. I warned you this episode would be about the problem of stolen people, not merely the act of their theft. Here, then, is the problem in full view. What happens after rescue? What happens when the freed must build? What happens when a people forged under coercion carries both memory of injustice and the institutional habits learned in surviving it? Mulhorand and Unther answer differently, but neither escapes the original crime cleanly. The descendants of the enslaved become heirs to divine intervention, yes. They also become founders of empires that will rule others. The miracle that saved them does not exempt them from reproducing hierarchy. It gives their hierarchy deeper symbolic fuel. That is one reason later histories of the old empires feel so heavy. They are never just about kings, campaigns, and temples. They are about a long, unresolved argument between rescue and replication. Did the Mulan break free of Imaskar, or did they inherit too much of the imperial grammar and simply conjugate it through gods instead of artificers? The honest answer, as usual, is both, which is why the old empires are worth your time. They keep the moral knot visible. They do not let you believe that liberation automatically teaches justice. Sometimes it teaches continuity first. Justice, if it comes, must be argued for again. And meanwhile, lest you imagine the matter concluded too tidily, Imaskar itself refused the courtesy of dying cleanly. Empires almost never do. The western heart of the realm was broken, Inupras lay ruined. The Mulan walked west. The old fertile basin of Raurin became a desert of ash and purple desolation. Yet eastward and below, fragments survived. The city of Solon endured for a time. In the eastern provinces, Kujawa claimed the dragon throne at Thakos and founded Anok Imaskar, a successor empire that would become one of the deep roots of later Shu Lung. Beneath the earth, the artificer Ilfemon gathered refugees and founded Deep Imaskar, a hidden continuation of the old tradition far from the judgment of the gods that had destroyed its parent. There is an entire philosophy of historical guilt in that distribution. One branch adapts and expands eastward, translating old imperial skill into a new civilizational line. One branch goes below, carrying memory inward and downward, preserving technique where repentance might have been more wholesome. One branch simply dies in the dust and leaves scavengers the privilege of asking whether genius deserves admiration when it has already salted the ground around itself. The answer, naturally, is complicated. I do not deny admiration to Imaskar's accomplishments. Only a fool or a propagandist would do that. The Imaskari built portal networks on a scale later realms scarcely matched. They normalized permanent extra-dimensional construction. They produced golems, artifices, storage systems, warding architectures, civic spellcraft, and theories of spatial mastery so advanced that many later mages encountering them mistook them for divine relics rather than the work of old human arrogance disciplined into method. They made a human empire think continentally, interdimensionally, and administratively all at once. That is why the category of Imaskar matters. Not merely the 7 great artifacts of that name, though those alone could keep treasure hunters, tyrants, and terminally overconfident archmages employed until the stars cool. No, Imaskar, as later ages use the word with varying precision, means something larger. It means the body of lost Imaskari magical technologies and conceptual tools by which space, transit, storage, labor, and access were rendered manageable. Not wondrous in the ornamental sense. Manageable. That distinction matters. Netherese relics often feel like flamboyant proofs of what magic can make possible for the already privileged. Imaskari relics feel more administrative. This is how one stores an empire's knowledge. This is how one places a district half a reality step aside. This is how one routes armies through linked circles without calling the road a road. This is how one binds a boundary so that prayer itself becomes subject to policy. A civilization's lost tools reveal what sort of problems it valued solving. Imaskar reveals a people obsessed with system. It is therefore among the most dangerous categories of lost magic in all Faerûn. Not because every relic explodes. Though some do, often with a professionalism one is almost obliged to respect. Not because each artifact houses apocalyptic force. Though some edge uncomfortably near that description. The real danger lies elsewhere. An Imaskari thing is often dangerous because it works on scale. It is infrastructure disguised as treasure. It encourages the finder to think not only, what can this do for me? But what could I build around this if I had enough labor, enough secrecy, enough nerve, and too little conscience? That is precisely how empires recur. Not by copying old banners, by rediscovering old methods. So when later adventurers speak breathlessly of purple stones, rooms larger inside than out, sealed citadels whose corridors shift according to command phrases no living tongue should still know, or monoliths that seem less erected than inserted into geography by a will too technical to be called architectural, they are not merely describing ruins. They are describing remnants of a state project. The palace bigger within than without. The vault that remembers a dead lord's priorities. The hidden gate still capable of deciding who may pass. The artifact that stores, sorts, or transmits not just power, but procedure. These things belong to a civilization that believed reality itself could be rendered legible enough to administer. That belief lingers in the ruins like heat. Treasure hunters feel it. So do scholars. So do later rulers, especially the unwise ones, who look at a dead empire's machines and imagine they can inherit function without inheriting fault. The realms is littered with the bones of such men. Imaskar also lingers in blood and language. The old Mulan carried their memory west, yes, but the peoples of the Hordelands and eastern expanses preserve other traces of Imaskari dispersal. Anok Imaskar's continuities reach into later Karaturan histories. Deep Imaskar remains, in its way, a kind of accusation, proof that the artificer tradition survived its moral defeat and preferred concealment to surrender. Even later, High Imaskar, in much more recent ages, demonstrates how stubbornly a civilization can attempt to resume itself if enough technique and grievance are preserved in the dark. This should not surprise you. Civilizations are not shamed out of existence merely because they deserve to be. They must be outlived, outbuilt, or starved of their enabling conditions. Imaskar lost its western heart because it committed a theft so complete that it invited divine warfare. But its habits of mind, its faith in managed space, its temptation to solve moral questions with technical barriers, its confidence that sufficiently advanced artifice may stand in for wisdom, remained available to descendants, imitators, and scavengers. The old empires born from the Mulan would discover that too. Consider one of the crueler ironies in later Eastern history. Centuries after Imaskar's fall, rebellious Mulhorandi and Untharik wizards made use of surviving Imaskari portal lore to open a gate to a distant world of militant orcs. The result was the Orc Gate Wars, one of the great disasters of later Faerûn, and in its course, Rhi himself would be slain by Gruumsh. There are whole shelves one could fill with the theological implications of that war, and perhaps in time we shall. For now, hold to the pattern, the descendants of stolen peoples ruling ancient states under divine mandate turned at last to the forbidden connective magic of their captors. And through that reopened wound, another catastrophe entered the world. History does have a sense of structure, though not always of mercy. What was the lesson there? That no legacy can be wholly quarantined. That a people may hate the empire that formed their suffering and still inherit its tools. That magical infrastructure, once introduced into a region's civilizational bloodstream, remains temptingly reusable even by those who know exactly how much blood it once cost. The Imaskari did not merely leave ruins, they left techniques of temptation. This perhaps is why Raurin exerts such fascination on later ages. It is not only the glamour of lost wealth or dead sorcerer kings, it is the feeling that under the dust lies a broken operating system for empire, a way of linking distant places without the politics of the roads between them, a way of storing knowledge outside ordinary institutions, a way of making space itself obey administration, a way perhaps of keeping rivals, gods or populations at just the right remove. Every age that grows impatient with negotiation eventually develops an appetite for such efficiencies. And every age flatters itself that it would use them more ethically this time. I have lived long enough to find that phrase an excellent burial omen. Deep Imaskar, especially, deserves a sterner glance than later romantics usually give it. There is a temptation to treat hidden successor states as poignant survivals, all cunning adaptation and tragic dignity. Sometimes they are. More often, they are continuities with better camouflage. A people that escapes judgment by going underground does not automatically become wise. It becomes hidden. The distinction is important. Deep Imaskari culture preserved old arcane sophistication, old secrecy, old confidence in controlled systems. Such preservation is historically interesting. It is not itself absolution. Nor does Imaskar provide a neat counterexample. Its eastward endurance shows that a shattered empire may continue by translation. Names shift, neighbors change, new ethnic syntheses emerge, old throne claims acquire local clothing, but the underlying civilizational habit, the use of refined magic and imperial structure to organize vast human populations, does not vanish. It simply survives in another frame. Thus, even when Imaskar falls, the problem of Imaskar remains. How much mastery over distance is too much for one state to hold safely? What happens when a ruling class begins to think of populations as relocatable components? What is the political cost of believing that separation between peoples, between rulers and ruled, between worshipper and God, between cause and consequence, can be made stable if only the barrier is clever enough? And perhaps most dangerously, what kind of minds are drawn to the remnants of a civilization that answered those questions by building ever more intricate systems rather than by restraining its appetite? These are not antiquarian curiosities. They are recurring policy questions in Faerûn, wearing older robes. Which is why I insist that Imaskar is not just a lost tech category in the manner modern collectors say the phrase, all greedy sparkle and inventory management. It is a category of state temptation. The old artificers teach that magic can be systematized into logistics, logistics into sovereignty, and sovereignty into a confidence so complete that theft begins to feel administrative. That lesson is still wandering the realms inside relics, ruins, bloodlines, and scholarly ambitions. One does not need an intact purple empire to repeat an Imaskari mistake. One needs only power, distance, and the conviction that people are movable. Which brings us at last to the deeper thesis beneath all this purple stone and old desert grief. Imaskar is not merely a warning against slavery, though it is certainly that. It is not merely a warning against arcane hubris, though the evidence there is sufficiently dramatic to satisfy even the most literal-minded moralist. It is a warning about what happens when empire building in Faerûn becomes cosmological before it becomes wise. That distinction is essential. Any state may tax, conquer, settle, fortify, and glorify itself. Such banal sins require no special talent. But some empires reach for more. They try to master the underlying conditions by which peoples remain peoples. Roots, distance, worship, memory, space, labor pools, succession of access. If a king can control roads, he rules movement. If a wizard can control portals, he rules roads without having to negotiate the land between. If an empire can move populations across worlds, cut them off from their gods, and house them inside managed systems of labor, it is no longer merely expanding territory. It is attempting to edit the metaphysical context within which politics occurs. Imaskar attempted precisely that, and the cosmos answered. Do not mistake me. I am not peddling the childish doctrine that every wicked empire is immediately punished by celestial auditors with impeccable timing. If that were true, half the shelves in this archive would be empty and the remaining half insufferably optimistic. No, many cruelties endure, many tyrants die in bed, many temples bless atrocities with very tidy liturgy. But there is a point at which power extends so far into the foundational relations of a world that consequence ceases to be merely political. Imaskar reached through planar boundaries, through distance, through religion, through identity itself. It did not simply enslave nearby enemies. It stole whole peoples from another world and then attempted to govern not only their bodies, but their access to transcendence. That is the kind of crime that changes the texture of reality around it. So Tar answered, so the Mulhorandi and Untheric gods crossed the spaces between worlds, so Horus struck down Yuvaraj. So fertile Raurin became desert. The rebellion was not only social, it was cosmological correction, and corrections of that scale never stop where moralists would prefer. Innocents die in them. Landscapes are rewritten. Later, peoples inherit the scar and must build upon it whether they approve of the justice or not. This is another reason I distrust romantic revolution as a genre. Real deliverance in Faerûn often arrives wrapped in collateral geography. That is not an argument against deliverance. It is an argument against sentimentality. Imaskar therefore belongs in the company of the realm's greatest and worst experiments. The dragons taught that raw, primordial dominion can shape the bones of an age. The giants taught that cosmic hierarchy can be turned into architecture and war. The elves taught that beauty joined to power may preserve and destroy in equal measure. The dwarves taught that continuity can be built if obligation is given stone. Imaskar teaches that human empire, when armed with sufficient artifice, becomes tempted to treat the world itself as an administrative medium. And once humans learn that lesson, they rarely forget it for long. This is why Imaskar matters so much to the wider history of Faerûn. It is one of the first great proofs that human ambition in this world need not be provincial, tribal, or merely dynastic. Humans can build at imperial scale. They can think in systems. They can create magical infrastructure that rivals elder races in sophistication, if not always in taste. They can alter the lives of millions through technical innovation applied ruthlessly enough. All the later human wonders and catastrophes sit in some measure downstream from that revelation. Imaskar is a beginning, a terrible one, but a beginning nonetheless. It is also a rebuke to the shallow habit of calling ancient magic mysterious, when what one really means is administratively complicated. The Imaskari were not mysterious to themselves. They had offices, titles, procedures, storage solutions, emergency redundancies, barrier maintenance, military transit doctrine, urban planning, slave management, dynastic logic. They took sorcery and made it bureaucratic. That may be the most human thing about them. An elf creates splendor and calls it harmony. A dwarf creates enduring process and calls it duty. A human creates a system so intricate that later ages mistake paperwork for destiny. Yes, I am being unfair, only slightly. This, however, is where the comparison to later Netheril becomes fruitful. We will speak of Netheril properly next time, when mythalars begin to hum and the sky itself becomes a human municipal ambition. But you should already feel the kinship and the difference. Imaskar treats magic as infrastructure hidden within an imperial machine. It centralizes access, routes power, controls movement, and solves political problems by making reality obey administration. Netheril will do something adjacent, yet distinct. It will democratize arcane literacy among an elite, scale magical convenience into culture, and eventually convert the sky into social proof. Imaskar asks how magic can make an empire unassailable. Netheril will ask how magic can make civilization itself transcend ordinary limits. Neither question is safe in human hands. Both are irresistible to human hands. And now perhaps you see why I wanted the Dwarven episode before this one. The Dwarves build roads and holds because continuity requires obligation. Imaskar builds portals and extra-dimensional capitals because continuity, in their view, requires control. That difference is not trivial. A road acknowledges terrain, a portal tries to abolish it, a hold negotiates with stone, an extra-dimensional palace refuses ordinary scale. A dwarven kingdom rules what it can maintain. An Imaskari empire increasingly sought to rule what it could isolate, root, store, and deny to others. One answer is conservative in the literal sense. The other is extractive in the cosmological one. Both are forms of civilization. Only one decided that if labor was lacking, another world might be searched like a granary. Again, I do not ask you to flatten the matter into slogans. The Imaskari were not fools cackling over chains in every chamber. They had scholars, urbanists, planners, craftsmen, perhaps even sincere patriots who believed they were preserving order in a difficult age. Some would have seen the Mulan importation as regrettable necessity. Some would have despised the priesthoods that failed them during plague and famine and genuinely believed divine removal from politics would spare the empire future destabilization. Some would have looked at the barrier against foreign gods and called it national security. Such people always exist. They usually write excellent memoranda. And yet, the structure remains what it was. A state in crisis solved its weakness by stealing people, institutionalizing the theft, and erecting a cosmological wall to preserve the arrangement. There are not enough elegant verbs in any language to improve that record. That is why I titled tonight's matter, in my own head at least, the problem of stolen peoples rather than the theft of stolen peoples. The theft is monstrous, yes, but the deeper problem lies in what follows. The captor empire becomes dependent on the stolen. The stolen develop shared institutions, trauma, and eventual political identity under coercion. Their gods are drawn into the matter. When liberation comes, it destroys not only the captor's legitimacy, but its landscape. The freed, in turn, found their own empires, and those empires preserve both memory of injustice and habits of hierarchy learned in surviving it. The original crime, therefore, never remains original. It breeds institutions. Empires are very good at turning crimes into institutions. History's work is to turn institutions back into visible crimes without losing sight of everything that subsequently grew around them. Mulhorand and Unther are therefore not footnotes to Imaskar's fall. They are part of its full cost. So are Deep Imaskar and Imaskar. So is the Orkgate catastrophe centuries later. So are every ruin explorer and every ambitious mage who ever looked at a purple stone threshold and thought, yes, but I would use it wisely. So is every later state that concludes it can solve social problems by rearranging populations rather than by governing justly. The first stolen people of Imaskar cast an extraordinarily long shadow. One might say, if one were a priest and had no respect for understatement, that the gods themselves cast it. I prefer a cooler phrasing. Imaskar proved that when power violates the sacred architecture of belonging, history no longer confines the bill to politics. And now the bill runs forward. You can watch it in the East for millennia. In the old empire's law, slavery and divine kingship. In their wars with one another. In their peculiar oldness compared to younger states. In the persistent fascination with Raurin. In the survival of portal lore. In the possibility that under enough dust one may still find a device that remembers how to sever nearness from access. All of these are continuations of the same old argument. What may a state do to secure itself, and what answers back when it goes too far? Every great realm in Faerûn eventually asks that question. The wise ask it early, the dead ask it late. Imaskar belongs very much to the second category. Yet, being honest, I must concede that the Empire also teaches one more uncomfortable truth. Civilizations do not become dangerous only when they are cruel. They become especially dangerous when cruelty is joined to competence. An incompetent tyranny may starve, blunder, and collapse before it rewrites too much. A competent one can build mechanisms that survive its founders. Imaskar was competent, intensely so. That is why its ruins are worth fearing. That is why its successor states mattered. That is why its afterlife continues to entangle adventurers, scholars, gods, and empires long after the banners themselves are gone. It is also why the realms remembers it with such peculiar tension. People hate Imaskar. People covet Imaskar. They do not always distinguish the two feelings. If you have listened carefully tonight, you will understand why that confusion is itself one of the Empire's final victories. A dead realm that can still train later minds to envy its methods has not entirely surrendered its sovereignty over the future. Do not give it that satisfaction. So before you leave the stacks tonight, carry these questions upward with care. When the Imaskari first opened portals to another world, at what moment did technical ingenuity become moral catastrophe? Was it the opening of the gate, the taking of the first captives, the decision to make an economy depend upon them, or the building of the barrier that turned prayer into contraband? Which step, in your judgment, made return most difficult? When gods cross worlds to answer the cries of their stolen worshippers, do we call that justice, rescue, invasion, or all three at once? And if the answer is all three, how should later peoples remember the deserts and graves left behind by that salvation? Did Mulhorand honor the memory of the enslaved by building law, continuity, and reverence around the rescued? Or did it betray them by keeping slavery within holier walls? Did Unther preserve ancient dignity under terrible pressure, or merely turn divine deliverance into a throne too old and too proud to remember why it was first needed? And what of Imaskar itself? Are the relics of Imaskar best understood as treasures, warnings, tools, temptations, or unfinished statecraft waiting for the next sufficiently clever fool? When you look at lost magic, do you ask what wonder it contains, or what political structure it once served? Sit with those. Dust is patient, and the East remembers in long horizons. Next time we turn to Netheril, where human ambition learns a different lesson from magic. Not how to steal labor across worlds, but how to build civilization directly upon arcane abundance. We will speak of the Nether Scrolls, of Mythalars, of enclaves, of arcanists who looked at gravity and decided it was an advisory custom. We will speak of Ulaum and Karsus, and of two philosophies of power that should never have been permitted to meet in the same species without supervision. That, however, is for another night. For now, remember that taleofthelich.com is live. The timelines are gathering there, the transcripts are gathering there. The old connective tissue between these episodes is gathering there, laid down carefully so that no age must be mistaken for an isolated spectacle when it is in truth part of a much older argument. If tonight's journey through Imaskar has left you wanting maps, sequence, and the deeper bones beneath the purple dust, go to taleofthelich.com. Merch is coming soon as well, because apparently the modern world insists that even warnings about cosmological empire should be available in wearable form. I remain skeptical, though I concede that a shirt prompting someone to ask what exactly was an Imaskari portal state would improve a distressing number of public gatherings. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. If you need a site built with clarity, systems built with foresight, or technical work done by people who understand that maintenance is part of truth rather than its annoying cousin, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. If the tale served you tonight, leave a rating or review. Modern memory is crowded with louder things than it deserves. Every act of support helps keep careful history from being buried beneath more convenient nonsense. Until next time, my apprentice, close the folio gently. Do not trust a gate merely because it is beautiful. Do not trust a ruler merely because they call domination necessity. And if ever you find, under desert stone or behind a wall too wide for the room it seems to occupy, an old device that promises to make distance obedient, ask first what price it once required and who was made to pay it. Empires love to call that sort of question impractical. Archives call it survival. Good night. May your thresholds be honest, your questions unwalled, your learning free of theft, and your judgment severe with any civilization that mistakes mastery over people for mastery over history.